What if I told you there are women in America, right now, who were born from their own fathers, raised in silence, and buried without ever having a name? This isn't a lost chapter from medieval history, or a plot from a horror film. This is real disturbing American history, happening in the forgotten corners of Appalachia, in locked rooms of rural Texas, and even behind closed doors in suburban neighborhoods. These are the true stories of inbreeding, generational trauma, and forbidden bloodlines that society chose to ignore. Some of these women were born with faces genetics couldn't hide. Others never learned to speak, never attended school, never escaped. Their stories were erased before they were written. But today, we break that silence. Welcome to one of the most shocking real-life cases of inbreeding in America, a haunting legacy that still lives on. If you're looking for dark, true stories, taboo family secrets, and the hidden costs of silence, then stay to the end. Because once you hear this, you won't forget it. They weren't monsters. They weren't myths. They were daughters, born from the shadows of bloodlines too close, raised in forgotten towns with names no one dared to repeat. These women weren't part of urban legends. They were real victims of generational inbreeding in modern America, living in silence, unseen and unheard. Some had no birth certificates. Others never spoke a word. Their bodies told stories their families refused to explain. This is dark, rural America, where true disturbing stories unfold not in headlines, but in whispers. And it all begins in a town with a name too perfect to be fiction. Odd, West Virginia, where one woman's womb would quietly birth a legacy of irreversible genetic collapse. What if I told you there are children in America, today, who were born from their own fathers, and women who lived their entire lives without ever speaking a single word? These aren't horror stories from the other side of the world. They're not medieval myths or forgotten folklore. They're real, recent, and terrifyingly close. In towns hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains, on dusty backroads of Texas, in secluded religious colonies and low-income suburbs, there are families where the same bloodline loops back into itself, over and over again. These are stories that never made the news. No headlines, no investigations, no justice, just silence. Generation after generation. Some children were born with faces twisted by DNA that should have never met. Some never learned to talk. Others were never given a real name. These are the dark secrets of real America. Stories only spoken about in hushed tones, if at all. And while most people will never hear them, never see them, you're about to. Because this isn't fiction. This is what happens when silence becomes a legacy, and the consequences are carved into bodies that no one wants to claim. And it all begins in a place called Odd. This isn't some dark fairy tale from medieval Europe. This is modern America, right now. And the nightmare is real. In the age of smartphones, DNA tests, and 24-hour news cycles, there are still families hidden in plain sight where bloodlines have turned in on themselves, again and again. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where fog clings to rusted fences and mailboxes haven't been checked in years. Entire generations exist without records, without diagnoses, without intervention. But it doesn't stop there. Inside religious communities that forbid outsiders, where marriage between cousins is encouraged, the silence grows even louder. And in the outer edges of suburbia, yes, even there, behind manicured lawns and blinds pulled just a little too tight, there are children being born with genetic deformities that science has already warned us about. These aren't isolated accidents. These are patterns, and no one is watching. This is the hidden epidemic of consanguinity in America. A taboo no one talks about until it's too late. Because once the damage is done, it can't be reversed. And sometimes, the most disturbing truths are the ones buried closest to home. Just waiting to be uncovered in places you'd never expect. You've probably walked past them without even knowing. Not because they're hiding, but because no one ever taught them how to be seen. They don't speak up. They don't make noise. They weren't given that power. Born into silence. Raised without birth certificates, medical care, or even proper names. These women live among us. In nursing homes. In forgotten trailers. On properties tucked behind rusting gates in dying towns. They are the unseen consequences of inbreeding in America. Daughters of daughters who were never meant to become mothers. Caught in a genetic spiral that science warned us about, but society chose to ignore. They were never in yearbooks, never in graduation photos, never had a Facebook profile or a school ID. And yet, they exist. Some can't speak, some can't walk, some can't even tell you their name, but we can, and we will. Because these are not fiction, not myth, not metaphor. These are real inbred women born in the United States, and their stories, buried for decades, are finally being told. This is their voice. This is their reckoning. And it begins with the woman who started it all. Her name was Maudie Bell Whitlow, and her legacy changed everything. Her name was Maudie Bell Whitlow, and she wasn't born into poverty. She was born into a closed loop of blood. In the hills of Odd, West Virginia, where time moves slower and strangers are met with silence. Maudie's story began long before she took her first breath. Her parents were first cousins. Their fathers were twin brothers. That meant Maudie entered the world already carrying a mirrored set of genes, a genetic echo chamber. But what came next would make her story one of the most disturbing true inbreeding cases in American history. Because Maudie didn't just carry the broken code, she passed it on. What she built wasn't just a family. It was a legacy of irreversible biological collapse. Generation after generation. And it all started when she chose a husband whose blood was nearly identical to her own. Maudie Bell Whitlow was born sometime around 1920 in a place almost too symbolically named, Odd, West Virginia. But there was nothing symbolic about what happened to her. It was biological. Her parents were first cousins. Their fathers? Identical twin brothers. That meant Maudie entered the world with a double helix already tangled before conception. A rare genetic concentration that doctors today classify as high risk. But back then, had no name. She didn't inherit a legacy. She inherited a loop. In the backwoods of Appalachia, where dirt roads turned to mud and families stuck together out of survival and superstition, Maudie's bloodline was already folding inward. No one saw this as dangerous. No one saw it at all. The town was isolated, the people self-sufficient, and medical care was a luxury no one demanded. And so the cycle began again. Maudie's very existence was a warning, unheard, unseen, and unanswered. Because when a child is born carrying the mirrored DNA of both parents, it's not just a birth, it's a countdown. And Maudie's countdown would echo across generations, changing not just her life, but the lives of every child she would bring into the world. Starting with her marriage to her double cousin. When Maudie Bell Whitlow came of age, she didn't leave Odd, West Virginia. She didn't leave the family land. She didn't even leave the bloodline. Instead, she married John Emery Whitlow, her double cousin, a man whose DNA mirrored hers so closely they were genetically closer than siblings. In the outside world, this would have raised alarms. But in Odd, no one asked questions. In isolated Appalachian communities, the blood didn't flow outward, it cycled inward. Marriage between cousins wasn't scandalous. It was tradition, survival, a way to keep land, lineage, and silence intact. There were no doctors warning of genetic collapse, no government oversight, no intervention. Just generations quietly handing off their broken code. In places like Odd, names repeat, faces blur, and family trees look more like circles than branches. Maudie's union with John wasn't just accepted, it was expected. The family believed what was familiar must be safe. But what they didn't see, what no one talked about, was that every generation doubled the risk. And when Maudie and John started their family, they weren't just passing down a name. They were passing down mutations, undiagnosed conditions, and a legacy of irreversible biological damage. What began as kinship would soon become calamity. Maudie Bell Whitlow gave birth to 15 children over the course of her life, but this wasn't a story of a big happy family. It was the slow, silent unraveling of a bloodline. Nearly half of the children never learned to speak. Some never even attempted to form words, only low, guttural sounds, like animals trying to communicate pain they didn't understand. One boy had a spine that curved like a question mark. Another had bowed legs so severe he could barely walk. A daughter's fingers never fully developed. Her hands hung limp, unable to grasp even a spoon. None of them went to a hospital. No doctors, no diagnoses, no birth certificates, just whispers. Locals called them off or touched, as if a vague word could cover the reality of multi-generational inbreeding deforming innocent lives. But in a town like Odd, West Virginia, where privacy meant survival, no one intervened. What happened inside that house stayed inside that house. The children rarely left the property. Their world began and ended within a few acres of dirt and rotting wood. And yet, behind those faded curtains and creaking doors, the cost of genetic silence was written across every limb, every face, every unfinished word that never came. One of Maudie's daughters would become the clearest reflection of what happens when a bloodline loops too tightly. Her name was Nellie Whitlow, and she was born into a world already cracked by silence. What happened to her wasn't sudden. It was the quiet collapse of biology repeating itself. And she wouldn't be the last. Because in another state, decades later, a different girl would be born. Not just from incest, but from something far worse. A father who was also her grandfather. Nellie Whitlow was one of Maudie's 15 children, but she stood apart, not because she was different, but because she was the purest mirror of what happens when genetics collapse in on themselves. Born with a limp, fragile body and distant, unfocused eyes that never seemed to track light. Nellie came into the world already disconnected. She never went to school, never spoke in full sentences, never left the property. Locals say she was seen once, just once, sitting barefoot on the front porch, holding a children's book upside down, flipping the pages slowly, pausing to press her nose against them as if she were trying to read with her breath. Some whispered she was simple, others said she was touched, but the truth was harder to name. Nellie was not the result of bad parenting. She was the outcome of too many generations trapped in one family line, a bloodline that circled instead of branching. There was no diagnosis, no intervention, just silence. And when she died, no obituary, no gravestone, no record. She disappeared exactly as she had lived, forgotten, unspoken, and erased by the very lineage that created her. But what came next would be even more disturbing. Because the next girl wasn't just born broken, she was born from a crime. Nellie Whitlow died exactly as she had lived, quietly, invisibly, and without ceremony. There was no obituary in the local paper, no funeral announcement, no record of the exact day her life ended. Her body was buried behind the family home beneath a patch of hardened dirt, marked only by a nameless wooden stake, weathered by rain and silence. No one from the outside came. No death certificate, no medical review. Just another body lowered into Appalachian soil, swallowed by the same genetic spiral that had defined her from birth. She wasn't a tragedy people mourned. She was a symptom they ignored. Nellie was what happens when a bloodline loops so many times it hits a biological wall, when silence becomes more dangerous than action. And yet, despite her life, despite her death, no one stopped the cycle. There were still more children to come, more unions unchecked, more damage coded deep within DNA. Nellie's story didn't end with her burial. It was just a pause, because a far more horrifying case was about to unfold hundreds of miles away. In a locked room where a baby girl would be born from a man who called himself both father and grandfather. In 2010, deep in a rural Texas trailer hidden from sight. A baby girl named Clara Rose Dempsey entered the world, under circumstances that would horrify even seasoned investigators. Her mother was barely 15. Her father, also her biological grandfather. The truth wasn't discovered immediately. Clara was born prematurely, her body frail and struggling. Doctors noted severe anomalies: a cleft lip, a malformed heart, and fluid swelling in her skull. She didn't cry like most infants. She barely moved. And when genetic tests were finally ordered, due to bruises that couldn't be explained, the results were undeniable. An extreme DNA match only seen in direct incest between a parent and child. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was a complete breakdown of generational safeguards, where biology and morality had both been erased. Her mother tried to defend the relationship as love. The state called it abuse. Both were arrested. Clara, meanwhile, became a silent ward of the system, unable to speak, unable to walk, living in a care facility with no known relatives willing to claim her. Now a teenager. She still wears diapers, still doesn't speak, still stares at the ceiling like she's waiting for a question no one will ever ask. And her story is far from over, because damage this deep doesn't fade. It echoes. Not every story of genetic collapse begins with violence. Some begin with tradition, quiet, accepted, and passed down like a family heirloom. In the heart of South Dakota, inside a deeply religious and insular farming colony, one woman was born not out of crime, but out of a culture that saw cousin marriage as preservation. Her name was Elsa Bergen, and while her mind stayed sharp, her body told a different story. Because when isolated communities ignore science in favor of custom, the consequences don't scream. They whisper through every feature, every diagnosis, every generation. And Elsa's story would become a medical case study in what happens when a gene pool forgets how to grow. But hers is just one side of the coin. Because in a city like Houston, another girl was born. This time not in a religious enclave, but in a modern hospital. And still, the result was the same. Another child trapped in the gap between culture and biology. Elsa Bergen was born into a world where the family tree didn't branch. It circled. In a secluded Hutterite colony in South Dakota, marriages between cousins weren't taboo. They were tradition, seen as a way to preserve faith, purity, and lineage. Her parents were second cousins. Her grandparents, also related. Over time, the gene pool didn't just shrink, it stagnated. Elsa entered life with severe facial deformities, an underdeveloped jaw, malformed ears, and a cleft palate that made feeding and speech difficult. But unlike many others born into closed-loop bloodlines, Elsa's mind remained clear. She learned to read. She mastered sign language. She eventually became a caretaker for younger children in her community. But her face, her bones, and every surgery she endured stood as a living warning. Because even when inbreeding isn't born of abuse, it still writes damage deep into the body. Elsa became a medical case study, not because her condition was rare, but because it was preventable. Her story breaks the illusion that faith alone can protect against science. And while her community stood by her, it refused to change. Which brings us to another girl, born far from tradition, but trapped by it just the same. Layla Nasser was born in 2011 in Houston, Texas. Not in the shadows of a rural mountain town, but in a modern hospital surrounded by technology and access. Her parents were first cousins, recent immigrants from a culture where cousin marriage was accepted, even encouraged. They believed it was tradition, but biology didn't care. Layla was born prematurely, struggling to breathe, her tiny body trembling from seizures within days. She had only one kidney. Her skull was unusually small. Doctors ran tests. The diagnosis came quickly and brutally: microcephaly, intellectual disability, and high developmental risk due to shared parental DNA. Layla was placed in a special education program by age 6. At 14, she still cannot read a full sentence. She speaks only in fragments. Her IQ remains below average. Her parents, overwhelmed, told doctors they were never warned. But warnings existed. They just weren't heard. Because when culture and science collide, it's the child who pays the price. And Layla, through no fault of her own, is living proof that some traditions, if repeated long enough, become inherited harm. But she is not alone. There are more stories like hers. Far more than most people want to admit. None of these women chose the blood they were born into. They didn't choose to come into the world with malformed jaws, missing organs, or minds trapped behind broken synapses. They didn't choose silence. Silence was chosen for them. From Clara Rose to Nellie. From Elsa to Layla. Every one of them is a living monument to a chain of choices made long before they could speak. Their bodies became archives of genetic mistakes. Their faces, a quiet scream that something had gone deeply, irreversibly wrong. You won't find their names in history books or medical journals, but you will find them in forgotten hospitals, rural care homes, and trailers hidden from the main road. What links them all isn't just inbreeding. It's the collective refusal, by families, by communities, by systems, to confront the truth before it was too late. And by the time anyone noticed, the damage had already been carved into their DNA. This is what happens when taboo replaces science. When culture shields silence. When no one says, stop. And still, for every story told here, there are others hidden, still unfolding. The white spaces on America's map aren't uncharted territories. They're places without voices, places where children are born without birth certificates, where medical records don't exist, and where entire lives pass without ever entering a system. These aren't remote jungles or war zones. They're rural counties in West Virginia, South Dakota, Texas, places where silence isn't just common, it's enforced. No paper trail, no school enrollment, no hospital logs. Just fading memories, unmarked graves, and families that never speak of what happened. These zones of silence allow generational trauma to thrive unchecked. And the most haunting part? We don't even know how many Claras or Nellies or Laylas are out there, because when you're not counted, you don't count. In these forgotten corners, abuse hides behind tradition. Disability is mistaken for divine punishment, and science is seen as betrayal. These are the blind spots in America's reflection, where the cost of ignoring uncomfortable truths shows up not in statistics, but in the twisted limbs and vacant eyes of children who never had a chance. They're not invisible. We just refuse to look. Maudie, Nellie, Clara Rose, Elsa, Layla. 5 names you won't find in textbooks or government databases. 5 women across 5 generations. All born into different times, different places, but united by one terrifying thread: society's refusal to speak. Each of them is a chapter in a story no one wanted to write. Their lives were shaped not just by broken DNA, but by broken systems. When families looked away, when doctors stayed silent, when communities chose comfort over truth, these girls paid the price. And while their bodies bore the burden, their voices were stolen before they ever had the chance to form. But here's the truth. Silence doesn't last forever. You can bury a name, but you can't bury a legacy. Not when the scars still breathe. Not when the stories still live. And now, their silence is screaming. In every diagnosis, every grave without a headstone, every child born with eyes that don't focus and mouths that never speak. This isn't coincidence, it's consequence. And the question now isn't how this happened. The question is, how many more will there be before someone finally listens? You might think these stories are rare, outliers from the shadows of forgotten places, but they're not. They're warnings, patterns, proof that silence is never neutral. It's complicit. From the hills of Appalachia to the clinics of Houston, the legacy of unchecked bloodlines and unspoken truths still lives on. And while the names may be hidden, the consequences are not. Because some of the women you've heard about are still alive, and their lives are far from over. This isn't a history lesson. It's a mirror. Because Maudie's descendants still live in Odd, West Virginia, on the same land, in the same house, barely documented, barely functioning, still trapped in a cycle no one interrupted. Layla is now 14, still living with her parents, still unable to read, still falling through the cracks of a system that never warned them. Clara Rose? She spends her days in a state-run care facility just outside Houston, strapped to a wheelchair she cannot push, staring through windows she cannot open. These aren't stories from a forgotten century. They're unfolding right now, in real time, behind real doors, in communities across America. And while their names may not trend, while their stories may never reach courtrooms or headlines, the weight of what happened to them lingers in every breath they take. This is not the past. This is the present, screaming quietly, daring us to notice. Because these women didn't disappear. We just chose not to see them. And they are still here, waiting, existing, silently bearing the cost of everyone else's silence. None of us choose the blood we're born into. We don't choose our genes, our parents, or the silence we inherit. But society does choose how it responds. We have laws, we have education, we have access to genetic counseling, science, and prevention. But is it enough? If Clara Rose can still be born in a locked room, if Layla can still live a life unseen, if Maudie's descendants can still exist in a place where birth certificates don't reach, then clearly, the answer is no. Systems don't just fail by accident, they fail by design. When comfort is prioritized over truth, when taboo replaces awareness, when not my problem becomes policy. These are not private tragedies. They're public consequences. And every time we look away, we give permission for the next child to be born into pain that was fully preventable. We can't change their pasts, but we can absolutely decide if their stories end here, or become warnings we finally decide to hear. Because in the end, turning away isn't just ignorance, it's complicity. None of the women in this story were ever interviewed. They never sat in front of a camera. They never wrote a memoir. They never told their side. Because they were never given the chance. Some couldn't speak. Others didn't have the words. But make no mistake, their bodies spoke volumes. The way Clara Rose stares at a ceiling, unable to lift her head. The way Layla struggles to form a sentence at age 14. The way Nellie once sat on a porch, flipping an upside-down book, smelling the pages like she was searching for something no one ever taught her to find. These women didn't testify in courtrooms, but their existence is evidence. Their silence is louder than any confession. And their pain, etched into every scar, every surgery, every misdiagnosis, is more honest than any official report. We don't need their words to know the truth. We just need to stop pretending we don't see it. Because silence doesn't mean nothing happened. Sometimes, it means everything happened, and no one cared enough to listen. Until now. If you saw a girl like Nellie, sitting alone, barefoot, flipping through a torn book upside down, would you keep walking? If you passed Clara Rose in a hospital waiting room, strapped to a wheelchair, her head tilted, eyes unfocused, would you glance away and pretend you didn't notice? Or would you stop? Would you kneel down and ask, "What's your name?" Because that question, simple as it sounds, carries the weight of everything they've been denied. Identity, recognition, humanity. These girls weren't just overlooked. They were erased before they were ever known. And every time we pass someone like them without acknowledgement, we continue the silence that broke them in the first place. You don't have to fix the past to honor the present. Sometimes, it starts with seeing what others refuse to see. Sometimes, it starts with a question no one else bothered to ask. Because the moment you ask a name, you give back something the world has taken, the right to be remembered. So ask, look, listen, before another child becomes another forgotten face in the waiting room of history. Don't let silence win again. Because silence isn't neutral, It's permission. And every time we ignore these stories, we allow them to keep happening. Maudie, Nellie, Clara Rose, Elsa, Layla. They were real. They still are. Their lives were shaped by choices they never made, and their pain was amplified by a world that refused to speak. If you believe they mattered, if you believe that their names deserve to be remembered, not buried, share this story. Let it be heard where no one was listening before. Because sometimes history doesn't just repeat, it reproduces, it spreads, it grows in the dark, and the only thing that stops it is light. This video isn't entertainment, it's a reckoning. It's a chance to speak for those who never could. So don't scroll past, don't look away. Because if we stay silent now, we become part of the very pattern that broke them. Speak their names, share their stories, and maybe, just maybe, we can stop the next one before she's born into silence. If this story left you unsettled, it was meant to, not to disturb, but to wake us up. Because the true horror isn't what happened, it's that it could happen again. Somewhere right now, a girl like Clara, or Nellie, or Layla is being born into silence. But if you're still watching, that means you care, and that means you're not powerless. Drop a comment below. Tell us which story hit you hardest. Save this video so you don't forget their names. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit subscribe, because we're not done. Not even close. History doesn't warn us with headlines. It whispers through the lives we choose to ignore. Let's stop ignoring them. Right now. Together.